Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like clinical engineering level precision, right?
Right, yeah, like it's objective.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is.
Broken or not broken.
Yeah. It's clean, it's visible, and it gives you a sense of absolute certainty.
And we crave that certainty, you know. The human mind naturally wants to categorize threats so we can formulate a direct physical solution. You just cast the arm, let the bone knit back together, and move on.
But the moment you step out of the hospital and into the world of sociology or cultural psychology or, institutional dynamics, that pristine x-ray machine just shatters.
Oh, completely. It's gone.
We are suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. It's all shadows and moving parts, and that is exactly why we are jumping into this deep dive today.
Yeah, because you need to understand what happens when a system is fundamentally re-engineered in the dark.
Right. And how one really controversial new author claims to have built, basically, a brand new x-ray machine to expose the entire apparatus.
And I gotta say, the ambition of this text is staggering, frankly. It attempts to map out the entire subterranean architecture of modern Western civilization.
It really does. But before we descend into that architecture, I need you to do a few things. First, make sure you like and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a deep dive.
Definitely do that.
Second, clear your schedule and buckle up, because today we are doing an intense, unvarnished review of a brand new 2026 ebook that is absolutely tearing up the charts right now.
It's everywhere.
It is. I highly recommend you open a new tab, check Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and buy the book right now so you can follow along. You will also want to follow the author at the handle at Conrad N. Riker on Substack.
Right, and she's on Twitter and YouTube too, so keep up with the fallout there. Having the source material open will be incredibly useful for this one, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Because the author builds her arguments like a mathematician writing proofs, just layering one syllogism on top of another.
So the book is called Gamma Bias Protocol: How Institutional Gynocentrism Protects Female Pathology and Punishes Men, by Sophie Marie Eve Riker. Let me set the hook for you here.
Go for it.
If you are someone, particularly if you're in the men's rights sphere or the red-pilled manosphere, who has ever felt this gnawing, almost unshakable suspicion that modern culture, corporate media, and our legal institutions are fundamentally engineered to make you apologize for your own masculinity.
Which is a feeling a lot of guys have right now.
Right. If that's you, this deep dive is going to decode exactly how the author claims that system was historically and linguistically built.
Yeah, we are looking at a dense, highly structured, and unapologetically confrontational piece of work today. It is really designed to be a shock to the system.
Which requires a vital, non-negotiable disclaimer before we go a single step further. We have to set the ground rules here. This text contains highly charged political, social, and psychological arguments aimed squarely at a specific demographic. We, as your hosts, are not taking sides today.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, and we are not condemning them. Our sole mission, our only job, is to act as impartial guides.
Just unpacking it all.
Exactly. We are here to unpack the fascinating historical, psychological, and institutional claims the author makes about the capture of Western institutions by what she terms feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right. Our goal is strict comprehension. We are treating this book as an artifact, analyzing the load-bearing walls of its argument to understand how it reaches its, frankly, explosive conclusions.
And the author takes the reader on a very deliberate journey, doesn't she?
She does. We don't just jump straight into family court statistics. We start with linguistics, examining how the definitions of everyday words were allegedly hijacked. From there, the text descends into depth psychology, attempting to identify the emotional void driving this societal shift. Only then do we scale up to macro-level institutions, watching how the state purportedly weaponizes the psychology.
And then finally, she lays out a tactical blueprint for male resistance.
Exactly.
So let's start with that linguistic hijack. Because the text argues that if you want to capture an institution, you don't need to fire a single bullet, right?
Or you just have to rewrite the dictionary sitting on the judge's desk.
Which is a wild concept, and the entire operation hinges on this concept the author calls gamma bias.
Yeah, gamma bias. This serves as the core operating system for the book's premise. The author defines this clinically as an institutional blind spot, basically a cognitive pathology operating at the societal level.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that actually look like?
Well, in this framework, Male agency is perceived as inherently malicious and aggressive, while female agency is perpetually excused as a defensive reaction to systemic victimhood.
Meaning the exact same action is judged entirely differently depending on who performs it.
Exactly.
So, like, if a man initiates a harsh corporate restructuring, he's a ruthless tyrant destroying lives for profit.
Right. But if a woman initiates the exact same restructuring, she's making brave, difficult choices because the oppressive market forced her hand.
Wow. So the text argues that when a woman accuses, the institution instinctively nods in empathetic validation. But when a man denies, the institution instinctively squints in suspicion.
It's a profound asymmetry in empathy, as she calls it. And the author uses this really striking analogy to illustrate how this linguistic matrix allowed an ideological movement to capture physical and cultural territory without actually building any of it.
Oh, the house builder analogy. Yeah, this is where the text really clicked for me visually.
It's a great metaphor.
The book asks you to imagine a factory worker who builds a house from scratch. He pours the concrete foundation, sweating in the sun. He runs the copper plumbing. He wires the electrical grid. He frames the walls. He puts up the drywall. He builds something out of nothing.
He does all the heavy lifting.
Yeah. Then a tenant moves in, immediately changes all the locks, stands on the balcony, and starts screaming that the builder is a dangerous trespasser who built a prison.
Such a vivid image.
The text argues this is the precise historical relationship between modern feminism and Western civilization.
Right, so the builder represents the historical physical labor and the logical engineering frameworks created by men. The aqueducts, the power grids, the hospitals, the entire system of jurisprudence.
All the infrastructure.
Yes. And the tenant represents a modern ideological movement that occupies these structures, reaps the benefits of the climate control and the running water, while simultaneously denouncing the people who built them as monsters.
But to make this work, to make the public buy it, the tenant has to redefine the very nature of the house. Which brings us to the book's breakdown of the word patriarchy.
Yeah, this is key. When you hear the word patriarchy today on a college campus or in a corporate HR meeting, it is instantly synonymous with tyranny.
It's a shorthand for an invisible system of male oppression that keeps women down.
Right, but the author argues that definition is a brilliant piece of linguistic sabotage. The text redefines the historical reality of patriarchy, not as a system of oppression, but as the teleological ordering of a survivable civilization.
Okay, I want to pause on that phrase, teleological ordering. For the listener who maybe hasn't brushed up on their philosophy recently, explain how the author applies that term to guys laying bricks and fighting wars.
Sure. So, teleology is the philosophical study of purpose or design. A thing's teleology is its ultimate goal.
Okay.
The book's argument is that before patriarchy, humanity lived in a brutal, short-lived state of nature where sheer violence ruled. Patriarchy was the structure driven by male sacrifice, physical production, and martial protection, whose teleological purpose was to transform chaos into a survivable civilization.
So it was an organizational necessity, not a malicious conspiracy.
Exactly. It built the infrastructure that eventually afforded society the luxury of even contemplating things like human rights.
So the tenant feminism changed the locks by changing the definition of the word. They took the inventory of every brick laid, every road paved, and every war fought by men to secure borders, and just rebranded the entire enterprise as a system of abuse.
That's the argument, yeah.
But a massive cultural shift like that doesn't just spontaneously generate out of nowhere. The author points the finger directly at a specific historical moment, right? The Frankfurt School.
Yes, the text traces this ideological lineage back to Marxist academics operating in the 1930s, specifically figures like Antonio Gramsci and Herbert Marcuse.
Right.
Now, original Orthodox Marxist theory relied on a very straightforward class struggle. The proletariat, the impoverished, alienated working class, was supposed to inevitably rise up and violently overthrow the capitalist bourgeoisie. That was the grand prophecy.
But the prophecy failed. The workers in America and Western Europe didn't exactly sharpen their pitchforks and storm the factories.
They didn't, because the capitalist system, despite its flaws, was actually generating unprecedented wealth for them.
Right.
The working class in capitalist nations was buying cars, moving into suburban houses, achieving stable, comfortable lives. The economic revolution failed to materialize because the workers were generally intent.
So what did the Marxists do?
Well, the text argues that these academics realized they were losing the economic argument. To keep the revolution alive, they had to pivot. They realized the culture itself was the glue holding the capitalist system together.
Oh, I see.
So they abandoned economic class struggle as the primary engine of revolution and replaced it with cultural grievance.
So it's like a football team realizing they absolutely cannot beat the opposing defense on the field. The other team is just faster and stronger.
Right.
So instead of practicing harder, they infiltrate the referee committee and secretly change the definition of a foul. Suddenly, the other team, executing a perfect, clean tackle, is penalized as unnecessary roughness. The rules of engagement are totally inverted.
That captures the mechanical shift the author describes perfectly. According to the book, the working class male underwent a profound linguistic redefinition during this pivot.
How so?
He transformed from being an oppressed proletarian brother who needed to be liberated into an oppressive bourgeois patriarch who needed to be overthrown.
Wow. So the target of the revolution shifted from the capitalist billionaire to just the everyday male providing for his family.
Exactly. And the primary tool used to enforce these new rules of engagement is a rhetorical sleight of hand known as the Mott and Bailey fallacy.
The Mott and Bailey. The text leans heavily on this logical fallacy to explain how institutions are paralyzed by HR departments today. Break down how this actually functions in practice.
Sure. A Mott and Bailey fallacy is a deceptive debate tactic where an arguer conflates two distinct positions. The first position is the Mott, named after the heavily fortified stone keep of a medieval castle.
Okay, the safe part.
Right. It is highly defensible, universally agreed upon, but relatively trivial. The second position is the Bailey, the sprawling, unfortified fields below the castle. This position is highly controversial, radical, and incredibly advantageous to the arguer, but very hard to defend logically.
So how does the author apply this to the modern corporate or academic environment? Like, what's the specific Mott and what's the Bailey?
The book uses the concept of workplace safety. The defensible Mott is women should be safe from physical violence and explicit sexual harassment in the workplace.
Sure, no rational person argues against that. The Mott is impenetrable.
Exactly. But the controversial Bailey is women should be insulated from objective performance evaluations, blunt logical critique, or having their feelings hurt when their ideas are challenged in a boardroom.
Oh, I see the trap. So if a male manager steps into the Bailey and says, look, your projections on this spreadsheet are fundamentally flawed and we need to redo them, the employee doesn't defend the math.
Right, she retreats immediately to the stone tower of the Mott and declares, "You are creating an unsafe environment for me."
Wow. The tactic conflates emotional offense with actual material harm. It uses the language of physical survival to shield against intellectual accountability.
And the text argues this is the linguistic matrix that traps modern men. They are constantly accused of physical aggression when they're merely exercising intellectual or professional agency.
But you know, if language is the tool of capture, rewriting the dictionary is only half the battle. You need an engine to drive that capture.
You need fuel.
Right. Why are millions of people willingly participating in this linguistic distortion? The text moves from sociology into depth psychology here, pointing to a profound internal crisis within modern womanhood.
It does. The book introduces what it calls the paradox of empowerment and victimhood, framing it as a literal logical explosion.
A logical explosion.
Yeah, in formal logic, an explosion occurs when a system contains a contradiction, which basically allows any arbitrary statement to be proven true.
So how does that apply to the modern feminist?
The text argues that the modern feminist demands the unyielding respect, authority, and autonomy of a hardened, stoic pioneer while simultaneously requiring the bureaucratic, padded protection of a vulnerable toddler.
Yeah, the author states you simply cannot be both.
Right. You cannot claim the absolute power of an independent sovereign agent when demanding a promotion or a leadership role, but immediately assume the role of a helpless, fragile patient the moment you are asked to be accountable for a failure.
It's an epistemological contradiction.
Exactly. And the text provides a massive, high-profile, real-world example to demonstrate this paradox in action.
Oh, the James Damore Google memo from 2017.
Yes.
The Damore memo was a cultural earthquake. Damore was a software engineer at Google who wrote a 10-page internal document meant to be read by his colleagues.
Right, and the document itself was largely a citation of peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology. Damore suggested that perhaps the gender disparities in certain high-stress STEM fields were not entirely the result of a massive, systemic, patriarchal conspiracy.
He was suggesting it might be partially explained by well-documented interest-based biological differences between men and women.
Yeah. And the author's point isn't even to adjudicate whether Damore's science was flawless, The book is laser-focused on the institutional reaction to the memo.
Right, because if these highly paid tech executives are the stoic, empowered pioneers they claim to be, you would expect them to dismantle his argument with data.
But the institutional response was the exact opposite of logical debate. The text notes that the corporate hive mind did not respond with a counter-syllogism. They did not produce a 10-page white paper citing conflicting neurological studies.
What did they do instead?
They responded with what the author terms an emotional apocalypse.
An emotional apocalypse.
Literally. Employees claimed they physically could not come to work. They took mental health days because a PDF document existed on a server. The VP of Diversity released a statement saying the memo advanced incorrect assumptions, but notably failed to specify a single one.
And Demore was swiftly fired.
Exactly. The text uses this to prove the paradox. These executives supposedly possessed the grit to lead global tech monopolies, yet required the HR department to protect them from a mild, heavily caveated piece of writing.
So what is driving this immense fragility? Because it's not normal. The author pulls heavily from Jungian psychology to diagnose the root cause here.
She does. She utilizes the concept of the negative animus. In Carl Jung's framework, the animus is the unconscious masculine psychological component within a woman.
Okay.
The author argues that under the pressures of modern feminist ideology, this animus has become deeply negative, mutating into a chaotic, resentful, and emasculating specter that effectively possesses the female psyche.
Because of this possession, the book claims modern women have been severed from their natural grounding, resulting in a profound internal emptiness, a spiritual and psychological void.
And, nature abhors a vacuum. When a human being cannot confront their own internal decay, lack of purpose, or absence of a stable identity, they project that chaos outward onto a scapegoat.
Which the book labels as the Bluebeard projection.
Yes, drawing from the old French folktale.
Right. Bluebeard is the wealthy, terrifying aristocrat who gives his new wife the keys to his castle, but tells her she must never open one specific door.
And of course she opens it.
Of course.
Yeah.
And she finds the bloody remains of his previous wives. He is the ultimate monstrous male figure.
But the author's brilliant twist on the folktale is her assertion that the forbidden room in modern society isn't a physical chamber of male darkness. The locked vault is the woman's own chaotic, unresolved interior.
Wow. So because she is terrified of opening the door to her own lack of accountability and emotional dysregulation, she paints the man as the blood-soaked monster.
Exactly. She manufactures a patriarchal villain to justify her own inexplicable rage. By convincing herself that Bluebeard is hunting her, her panic feels justified rather than pathological.
This directly leads to the text's argument about the historical understanding of emotional dysregulation. And here is where the book wades into incredibly controversial waters. The author explores the etymology of the word hysteria.
Yeah, this part is wild. The word traces back to the ancient Greek word hystera, which literally translates to womb.
Right. And the book claims that for millennia, across various cultures, observant physicians and philosophers understood that extreme female emotional dysregulation was fundamentally tied to biology and hormonal fluctuations.
It was recognized as a clinical physiological reality.
So the text argues that the ancient Greeks weren't committing an act of blind, malicious misogyny when they coined the term. They were practicing early empirical observation.
And the author's provocative conclusion is that modern feminism did not cure hysteria or liberate women from it. Instead, it merely democratized it.
Democratized it.
Yeah, it took a personal, clinical difficulty that used to be managed privately or medically and transformed it into a mass political weapon. Untreated emotional chaos now masquerades as political activism, dictating public policy and writing corporate HR mandates.
But wait, if the ideology demands these incredibly safe, perfectly HR-compliant, submissive men who never challenge the Bailey, why does the text point out the massive financial success of dark romance literature among these very same women?
It's a glaring contradiction.
Huge. The book mentions the billions of pages read on Kindle, where the male love interests are essentially dangerous, untamable, aggressive alpha males. The mafia bosses, the billionaires, the literal monsters.
The author codifies this contradiction as the modern hypergamous paradox. It operates as a tragic syllogism.
Walk me through it.
The major premise is that female hypergamy, biologically, programs women to seek out the highest status, most dominant, capable male who can provide physical protection and resources.
Okay.
The minor premise is that feminist-Marxist ideology explicitly demonizes male dominance, labeling stoicism as toxic and framing physical protection as coercive oppression.
So they are actively at war with their own neurobiology.
Exactly. The inescapable conclusion of the syllogism is that the modern feminist is driven into a state of permanent, agonizing cognitive dissonance.
Ah.
She is ideologically commanded by her university and her peers to despise the very traits her biology commands her to desire. She stands at the HR podium demanding a submissive, apologetic beta male in public policy, but retreats to her apartment to fantasize about the dangerous, unregulated alpha male in her Kindle library.
Because she can never be satisfied since her politics have criminalized her desires.
Precisely.
That is a staggering psychological diagnosis. But, thoughts, projections, and Kindle algorithms don't freeze bank accounts or alter custody agreements. Laws do.
Right.
If this psychological void is as powerful as the author claims, it wouldn't just stay confined to interpersonal relationships or corporate memos. It would inevitably bleed into our legal institutions.
And that is exactly where the text points next. The jurisprudential abattoir, specifically focusing on the family court system.
The author argues that the government observed this psychological dynamic, this desire to project blame and extract resources without accountability, and stepped in to monetize it.
The state recognized a lucrative opportunity, and the primary weapon forged in this legal arsenal is a framework known as the Duluth model.
The Duluth model, created in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota, originally pitched as a progressive socio-psychological protocol for domestic abuse intervention.
Right, on paper, it was a way to standardize police responses to domestic disputes, but the text argues it functions in reality as an ideological cudgel that encoded gamma bias directly into the DNA of the justice system.
How does it do that?
Well, the model is built on a power and control wheel that explicitly frames domestic violence not as a complex interpersonal dynamic, but as a patriarchal tool used exclusively by men to subjugate women.
Detail how this actually plays out when the police show up at a house. The author claims this model systematically erases female-perpetrated domestic violence and covert relational aggression.
Yeah, under the strict interpretation of the Duluth model, if police arrive at a domestic disturbance, the framework predisposes them to identify the male as the primary aggressor, regardless of the nuanced reality of the situation.
So it legally encoded the premise that men are inherent perpetrators of violence and control, and women are inherent victims acting only in self-defense.
Right. If a woman is throwing plates and the man grabs her wrist to stop her, the man is often the one arrested because his physical strength is viewed as the mechanism of patriarchal control, while her violence is viewed as a frantic reaction to his unseen oppression.
The text mentions the Violence Against Women Act, or VWA, as the ultimate federal institutionalization of this bias. It argues these laws have expanded the definition of abuse so far that they effectively criminalize male rationality and competence by labeling them as coercive control.
Yeah, the example the book gives is pretty stark. If a man restricts his wife's access to credit cards because she has a severe gambling addiction and is bankrupting the family, under these expansive frameworks, her lawyers can frame his actions as financial abuse and coercive control rather than the competent management of a crisis.
Which is terrifying. The author views this legal framework as what she terms a satanic inversion of the natural family hierarchy. It flips the teleological order completely upside down.
Let's unpack that hierarchy, because it's central to her argument. The text outlines the traditional natural order of a survivable society as flowing from God to man to woman to child.
Right. The man stands as the shield between the harsh world and the family, bearing the brunt of the danger.
But the book proposes that modern family courts have executed a hostile inversion of this order. The proposed modern inversion places the state at the absolute top of the hierarchy, followed by the woman, then the child, and finally, the man is relegated to the absolute bottom.
So the father is systematically stripped of his authority while retaining all of his financial liabilities.
Exactly. And the state moves to the top, acting as what the author bluntly calls the institutional husband.
This is one of the most provocative metaphors in the entire book.
It's a pivotal structural concept. The author posits that by rejecting the individual biological husband, who might demand accountability, compromise, or basic respect in exchange for his provision, the modern woman marries the state.
The state, wow.
Through legal mechanisms like no-fault divorce, guaranteed alimony, and aggressive taxation, the state uses its monopoly on violence, meaning the police force and the threat of prison, to extract resources from the biological father.
So the state effectively becomes the new provider, laundering the man's money and handing it to the woman without any of the interpersonal friction of a real marriage.
And the book uses this incredibly degrading term, milking cow.
Yeah, I saw that.
It says the father is reduced from a protector, a teacher, and a patriarch into a mere biological necessity, a milking cow for state revenue, and a marginalized weekend visitor in his own children's lives.
The text also points out a massive, tragic sociological contradiction that the courts willfully ignore to maintain this system. It brings up what it calls the Birkenhead Protocol.
Right, describing it as an ironclad, unspoken legal presumption of maternal superiority in almost all custody battles. The courts assume the child belongs with the mother, regardless of her psychological state.
And the text points directly to the macroeconomic and sociological statistics to prove the damage this causes. We are constantly told by the culture that the traditional two-parent patriarchal home is an oppressive, stifling construct. But what do the numbers actually say?
The numbers are grim.
The book cites data showing that single-mother households correlate with massively higher, disproportionate rates of juvenile delinquency, childhood poverty, teenage substance abuse, and eventual adult criminality.
Yet, the author argues the state machinery actively continues to remove children from the statistically safest environment, the two-parent home anchored by a father, and repeatedly places them in the statistically most dangerous environment.
Why? Why would they do that?
The book alleges the state does this simply to appease the female animus and validate the illusion of independent empowerment. The state willingly trades the child's optimal psychological development and physical safety for the mother's emotional validation and the state's continued bureaucratic expansion.
It's essentially a hostile corporate takeover of the family, where the government acts as a ruthless liquidator. Think about it. The government comes in, breaks up the company, sells off the assets, fires the CEO, the father, and installs a chaotic middle manager who runs the company into the ground.
All while the government continues to collect exorbitant consulting fees in the form of court costs and child support processing.
That is a grim, deeply cynical, but perfectly accurate reflection of the author's central thesis regarding the family courts. The courts are not a place of justice. They are a resource extraction mechanism.
But where does the state get the money to act as the institutional husband on a massive societal scale?
Yeah.
Because the extraction of resources from divorced fathers isn't enough to fund an entire civilization.
Right.
They also argues that this civilizational Ponzi scheme goes way beyond family court and forms the foundation of modern corporate and macroeconomics.
Okay, so the author scales up the argument, taking aim at the crown jewel of feminist economic theory, the wage gap. She attempts to dismantle the foundational myth that the economy is designed to shortchange women.
The famous 84 cents on the dollar statistic. It's repeated in every political campaign, every HR seminar, and every sociology class in the country.
Yeah, we hear it constantly. So how does she tackle it?
The text applies a rigorous analytical tool. It calls a formal logical distinction used in classical philosophy to separate a truth from a conflated falsehood.
Okay, lay it out.
The author concedes the raw aggregate statistic. Yes, if you put every single working man and every single working woman into two giant buckets and average their overall lifetime earnings, there is a gap. But the author argues that the gap is entirely the result of free will, not discrimination. When economists control for granular variables like occupational hazard, hours worked per week, willingness to travel, and continuous uninterrupted workplace tenure, the supposed discriminatory gap vanishes to statistical zero.
The hazard pay element is heavily emphasized in the book. It points out the brutal reality that men work roughly 96% of the most physically dangerous, highest paying, least desirable jobs on the planet.
Right.
Men are the ones dying in collapsed mining trenches, freezing on deep-sea oil rigs, and falling from high-tension electrical steel beams. They trade their physical safety and their lifespans for higher capital returns.
Which leaves the author to deliver one of the darkest, most biting rhetorical quotes in the entire text.
I have it highlighted right here. To believe the wage gap proves female oppression is to look at a man dying of black lung in a coal mine and complain that his widow's feelings are hurt because she earns less as a part-time barista.
That is just, wow.
It is brutal, scorched earth rhetoric.
It is deliberately designed to be shocking, you know. The author is using aggressive rhetoric to completely shatter the Mott and Bailey defense we discussed earlier. She is forcing the reader to look at the blood and sweat that underwrites the economy.
And then she scales this economic extraction up to an even more provocative, controversial claim regarding macroeconomics and global immigration. She codifies it as the DEI borders syllogism.
This part of the book is explosive. The author argues that open borders and mass immigration are not the result of a humanitarian glitch or bleeding heart empathy. They are a mathematical necessity of the welfare state's Ponzi scheme.
The logic of the syllogism runs like this, right? Because native-born women in Western nations are experiencing what the author terms demographic suicide, meaning birth rates have plummeted far below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman, the welfare state is rapidly running out of future taxpayers.
Right. If the state has promised to act as the institutional husband, guaranteeing endless welfare, subsidized healthcare, pensions, and safety nets to women who are no longer relying on husbands, it needs an astronomical amount of money to pay for that.
It needs what the book coldly refers to as replacement tax cattle.
Since the native population is no longer producing these future taxpayers, the state must import new populations to fund the aging infrastructure and the pension Ponzi scheme.
But the text argues there's an even deeper subconscious psychological drive at play here on a civilizational scale. It's a macro dual mating strategy.
And it uses the 2015 Angela Merkel European migrant crisis to illustrate this staggering claim.
Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, the famous defining phrase of that era, "Wir schaffen das, we can manage this."
Right. Merkel unilaterally suspended the Dublin regulation and opened the gates of Germany, and by extension Europe, to over 1 million mostly military-age males from highly patriarchal, non-assimilating cultures.
And the global media uniformly framed it as the ultimate act of maternal humanitarianism.
But the author frames it as an act of gynofascism.
Gynofascism.
Yes. The text argues that the female leader of a demographically dying empire imported a massive replacement population to prop up a failing socialist pension system. But psychologically, the author claims it functions as a societal dual mating strategy playing out on the world stage.
Okay, this is wild. How does that map onto immigration?
Well, the native women seek the state as the safe, predictable beta provider to guarantee their resources and pensions, but subconsciously they import the untamable, hyper-masculine, dangerous foreign element as the alpha seed to fulfill the biological desire for psychological arousal and chaos that their HR-compliant native men can no longer provide.
That is a wild, mind-bending synthesis of evolutionary psychology and geopolitics. The state acts as the beta bucks, the imported men act as the alpha seed. It's taking the most primal, personal dating dynamics and mapping them directly onto international border policy and demographic shifts.
It's an incendiary claim, deeply unsettling to read, but it fits flawlessly into the book's overarching structural thesis of gamma bias and unregulated hypergamy driving public policy.
Okay, let's step back and look at the whole board for a second. How do you convince an entire generation of intelligent people that this civilizational Ponzi scheme, this linguistic sabotage, this psychological projection, this legal abattoir is actually a righteous moral crusade?
Right, because you can't just enforce it with police. You have to indoctrinate the public.
Exactly. And the author argues this constant, unending production line of grievance is manufactured in modern academia. Welcome to the academic kangaroo courts.
In this section, the university is no longer framed as a bastion of enlightenment or a place of rigorous learning. It is diagnosed as a factory of delusion.
And the primary enforcement mechanism for this delusion is the weaponization of Title IX.
Now, Title IX was originally passed in the 1970s to ensure equality in federally funded education, most famously applied to creating equal opportunities in women's collegiate sports.
Right. It was a straightforward legislative push for equal access, but the text argues it was deliberately perverted by bureaucratic activists into a star chamber.
Specifically, the book points to the shift toward affirmative consent standards and the absolute weaponization of the concept of safety.
The book talks about how, under these new academic tribunals, subjective feelings have completely replaced objective evidence. The phrase, "I feel unsafe," is described by the author as an unfalsifiable sorceress incantation.
The author uses the word incantation because it bypasses logic entirely. You cannot cross-examine a feeling.
No, you can't.
If a male student brings texts and geolocation data proving his innocence, but the female student simply states she felt unsafe in his presence, the institution's gamma bias kicks in. The burden of proof is fundamentally inverted. The man is presumed guilty until he can prove a negative, which entirely destroys the concept of due process.
And the text brings massive receipts to back this up. It details how these academic environments fostered systemic, high-profile false allegations that were protected and amplified by this bias.
It walks through the Duke lacrosse case, where players' lives were ruined by a prosecutor chasing an activist narrative.
The University of Virginia Rolling Stone hoax, where a journalist abandoned all fact-checking to publish a fabricated gang rape story because it fit the ideological narrative.
And Emma Solkovich at Columbia University.
Oh, the mattress girl saga.
Exactly. She
Yeah.
famously carried a dorm mattress around the Columbia campus for months as a piece of performance art because the university tribunal wouldn't expel a man she accused of assault.
And the mainstream media lauded her as a courageous hero, inviting her to galas. But the text points out the stark ignored reality. The accused man possessed reams of text messages explicitly proving enthusiastic consent, ongoing flirtation, and a completely amicable aftermath.
The book describes her mattress campaign as a literal public shit test that the entire academic apparatus rewarded with course credit and media praise instead of psychiatric help.
The author argues that this institutional blindness happens because modern academia has explicitly abandoned the trivium.
The trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the foundational blocks of classical education.
Yes, the classical tools required to discern reality. The text argues that universities no longer teach grammar to fix subjective definitions of words, allowing meanings to slide based on political convenience.
They no longer teach logic to validate reasoning and identify fallacies. Instead, they teach the supremacy of subjective lived experience, where your identity determines the truth value of your statements.
To prove the absolute intellectual rot of these departments, the book highlights the Sokol Squared hoax. This is arguably the most devastating, undeniably hilarious piece of evidence in the entire book.
It is a damning indictment of the peer review process in what the author calls grievance studies. In 2017 and 2018, a group of frustrated traditional academics decided to test the system.
They submitted intentionally broken, logically absurd, and morally repugnant papers to leading peer-reviewed journals in fields like sociology, gender studies, and queer theory.
And we are not talking about subtle fakes. They literally took a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, replaced the anti-Semitic buzzwords with intersectional feminist rhetoric, and a top-tier feminist social work journal published it.
You're kidding?
Literally. They wrote a paper arguing that dog parks are sites of systemic canine rape culture and oppression, and it got published. How does that happen?
It happens because the reviewers in these departments are no longer standing for logical consistency, empirical data, or objective truth. They are scanning for ideological compliance.
The hoaxers realized that as long as the paper concluded that white men are oppressive and Western structures are inherently evil, the reviewers would overlook any absurdity.
The text uses Sokol Squared to definitively prove that the modern humanities are entirely devoid of logos. They don't pursue truth. They function exclusively as a taxpayer-funded cult for the perpetuation of resentment.
Wait, let's follow the money here. If the universities are completely devoid of logos, if they are just publishing literal madness about dog parks, how does the system survive? If everyone is studying grievance, who is keeping the lights on?
The text answers this by pointing to what it calls the poverty of resentment. The system only survives because it operates as a parasitic organism.
How so?
It relies on extracting the vast wealth generated by the competent men, the engineers, the plumbers, the farmers, the builders, to subsidize the grievance studies departments through taxes and exorbitant federally backed student loans.
So the builders are laying the rebar and maintaining the power grid, while the academics sit in air-conditioned towers funded by the builders' taxes, writing grand proposals about how they are oppressed by the builders.
Exactly. Which perfectly transitions us into the metaphysical heart of the book, because the author pushes this beyond just bad economic policy, bad law, or corrupt academia. She argues that this entire cultural movement is fundamentally a metaphysical rebellion against reality itself.
The occult, the satanic inversion, and the rejection of logos.
Right. The book goes full philosophical here, attempting to explain the spiritual void at the center of the culture. And it does this by examining the massive cultural phenomenon of witch talk.
Witch talk. Over 30 billion views on TikTok. You have millions of young women using smartphone devices which rely on incredibly precise quantum mechanics, satellite telemetry, and global supply chains built almost entirely by men.
They are sitting in climate-controlled offices powered by coal or nuclear grids maintained by men.
And what are they doing? They are staring into screens, relying on $5 amethyst crystals bought on Amazon, casting hexes, and blaming the astronomical position of Mercury in retrograde for their inability to maintain a stable adult relationship.
The author points out the sheer comedic tragedy of it, but she refuses to dismiss it as just silly internet behavior. The text frames this as the ultimate ontological failure. It is a literal, conscious rebellion against the logos.
Define logos as the author uses it here? Because it's a heavy word with a lot of theological baggage.
In classical philosophy and Christian theology, the logos is the rational divine order of the universe. It is the underlying architecture of reality, encompassing the three transcendentals: objective truth, objective beauty, and objective goodness.
So the text argues that feminism and cultural Marxism actively seek to dismantle objective reality, replacing the logos with solipsistic relativism, witchcraft, and institutionalized delusion.
And the author calls this a satanic inversion.
Because it glorifies victimhood as a virtue, revels in dependency while calling it independence, and actively punishes the competence that keeps society from collapsing.
The author states it is the serpent's ancient lie from the Garden of Eden scaled up to civilizational proportions. The rebellion against the Creator, the rejection of boundaries, and the denial of the natural order.
The text uses the visceral, unhinged reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, as the ultimate proof of this metaphysical rot.
Right. It argues that when the institutional scaffolding of abortion was legally threatened, the response wasn't a rational, constitutional, political discourse. It was viral campaigns of modern witches mobilizing online to hex Supreme Court justices.
The book calls abortion a reproductive blood right and the ultimate ego defense against biological accountability.
The argument is that they traded reasoned debate for literal spellcasting because they are entirely possessed by the negative animus. You cannot use a syllogism to argue with a spellcaster. They have abandoned the realm of reason entirely.
Okay, let's take a breath. We have covered the author's entire grim diagnosis.
The linguistic sabotage of our dictionaries, the psychological void driving the madness, the family court abattoir extracting the wealth, the economic Ponzi scheme importing replacement cattle, the academic kangaroo courts laundering the ideology, and the metaphysical rebellion against reality itself.
We are looking at a terminal civilization, according to Riker. So, what is the prescription? What is the author telling the men listening to this deep dive to actually do?
This brings us to the final act, the inner citadel and androcentric reconstruction.
After diagnosing a terminal disease, the author does not suggest trying to cure the patient. She doesn't suggest voting harder or writing letters to your congressman.
No, the prescription is total, unapologetic strategic separation.
Building the inner citadel.
Yes. The text defines the inner citadel very precisely, borrowing from Stoic philosophy. It is not a physical bunker in the woods with canned beans and ham radios. It is a state of impenetrable, intellectual, spiritual, and emotional invulnerability.
And how do you build this invisible fortress?
Through the rigorous daily application of the trivium that the universities abandoned.
You use grammar to pin down the exact objective definitions of words so you can never be manipulated or guilt-tripped by HR buzzwords. You use logic to instantly identify and crush the fallacies of the matrix, recognizing the Mott and Bailey before it traps you.
And you use rhetoric to deliver the punishing truth without apologizing.
The book emphasizes that you have to completely isolate your intellect from the toxic spores of emotional terrorism. And it gives a highly specific, tactical, almost uncomfortably relatable example of how to execute this in everyday domestic life. The Thanksgiving kitchen ambush.
Oh man, this is a masterful microscopic breakdown of how the macro ideology plays out in the living room. Let me set the scene exactly as the book paints it. A husband is hosting Thanksgiving, guests are in the living room. The wife, according to the text, is hormonally triggered or emotionally dysregulated, subconsciously seeking a chaotic crisis to alleviate her own internal void. She walks into the kitchen and detonates a historical grievance out of nowhere. She yells, "You never value my mother. You always disrespect my family."
Now, the text analyzes the two paths a man can take in this moment. The beta male path is to engage the premise. He argues the facts. He lists the 3 times he drove her mother to the airport.
He justifies his actions. He tries to negotiate a peace treaty.
And he loses immediately. Why? Because by arguing, he has implicitly validated her delusion. He has entered her frame of emotional chaos.
But the citadel-dwelling man deploys silence. He does not argue the facts. He looks at her calmly, completely unbothered, states flatly, "We are not discussing this now," and he literally turns his back and walks out of the kitchen.
He starves the hysteria of oxygen.
The author analyzes the incredible tactical power of silence against what she diagnoses as borderline personality dynamics. The chaotic female psyche, lacking a solid internal core or a sense of object constancy, experiences male silence as a terrifying, expansive void.
Boredom and lack of engagement equal panic.
But for the disciplined male intellect, silence is a sanctuary. It is breathing room. It is the cold anvil upon which self-mastery is forged.
The rule is simple. You do not negotiate with an emotional terrorist. You withdraw your presence and your provision until order is restored.
Exactly. And the text expands this strategy from the kitchen to society at large. It advocates for the formation of guilds.
Yes, the macro strategy.
Yeah.
The book outlines practical, drastic steps. Refuse to sign state marriage licenses, because doing so invites a hostile third party, the state, the institutional husband, to take supreme authority over your assets and your children.
Withdraw every ounce of financial and intellectual support from woke corporations and form these guilds.
Guilds are envisioned as shadow economies based purely on brutal merit. Men doing business exclusively with other competent men, refusing to hire based on diversity quotas or ESG scores.
If a massive Fortune 500 company prioritizes gender identity over engineering competence, let it collapse under the weight of its own ineptitude. Do not try to save it. Walk away, form a guild, and build a superior competitor in the shadows.
I have to ask the obvious question, though. I'm reading this and thinking, is this just running away? Is the author basically telling men to take their ball and go home because the game is rigged?
The text anticipates that exact critique and addresses it directly. It says, no, it is absolutely not running away. It is starving the beast. The entire bloated matrix requires male labor, male ingenuity, and male taxes to survive for even a week.
If the builders withdraw their consent, the system falls.
The text uses a powerful prophetic comparison between two archetypes to illustrate the endgame, John and David.
Break down John. Who is he?
John is the archetype of the HR-appeasing middle manager. He's the guy who nervously attends the mandatory unconscious bias training. He nods along to the feminist animus. He puts his pronouns in his email signature, and he happily throws his male colleagues under the bus, hoping the crocodile eats him last.
The text says John is building a house on quicksand. When the economic matrix inevitably collapses, John will be destroyed by the very system he slavishly served, because he has no hard skills and no inner citadel.
And David?
David is the author's vision of the new man. He is the independent tradesman who operates a cash-friendly business. He employs only competent, stoic men. He spends his evenings not watching Netflix or reading Aristotle, mastering the trivium, and lifting heavy iron to build his physical resilience.
David is quietly quarrying stone.
And the text prophesies that David and the guild he builds will seamlessly inherit the earth when the current ideological matrix collapses under the weight of its own insurmountable contradictions.
Man, that is a heavy, sweeping, and undeniable radical vision of the future. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for this deep dive.
Let's hear it.
The author states repeatedly throughout this book that reality has a cash value, and the bill always inevitably comes due. You can manipulate the dictionary, you can rig the family courts, you can publish fake papers about dog parks, but you cannot fake a power grid.
The entire matrix of modern society, the air-conditioned skyscrapers, the digital infrastructure, the complex legal frameworks, requires the sweat, blood, and taxes of men to function.
It is a system entirely subsidized by the exact demographic it relentlessly demonizes.
So here's the question for you to mull over, to really explore on your own as you go about your week. What happens to the world the day the builders simply decide to stop apologizing?
What happens the day they put down their tools, silence their phones, and start walking away? Does quiet, unyielding refusal become the most powerful weapon of all?
It's the ultimate, terrifying stress test of the entire system.
Truly. All right, that is all the time we have for today's intense deep dive into the incendiary new ebook, Gamma Bias Protocol. I want to remind you all, open a new tab right now, head immediately to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and buy this book.
The author specifically asks that you leave a 5-star review as a beacon for other men out there trying to find the citadel.
The arguments are complex, the rhetoric is sharp, and it's a text designed to provoke the kind of deep structural analysis our culture desperately needs right now.
Absolutely. Make sure you follow the author for more unvarnished truth at Conrad N. Riker on Substack, as well as keeping up with the conversation on Twitter and YouTube.
And finally, please like and subscribe to our show for more deep dives into the most fascinating, provocative, and worldview challenging materials out there. Until next time, keep building your citadel.